I was very glad to see the interest of young chemists in terms of trying to address issues that are really important to our society, for example, climate change issues, and also the interest to really get into potentially politics to make an influence on the policy making.
So we decided to do this event in a less formal way than a presentation. And also because we are so used to listen to scientific talk, and so we decided to more be a discussion. So how I will explain you shortly how it will work. So I will start with the question to our guest. And after inside the room, we have two moderators. They will first ask some questions. And after we will give you the opportunity also to ask a question to our guest. So, of course, the first question that we want to ask is, so I will be nice and start by you, Professor Barrow. We for sure would like to know, finally, what about you? To know more, what the reason why you choose to go to science, and so if you can explain this in a few words.
Okay. Well, I always loved cooking and making things when I grew up. So science kind of was a natural thing for me to choose. And it probably also helped. My father was a physics professor and my mother was a chemistry professor. So I didn't have too many choices. I guess the family influence was quite strong.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. But it's very nice. And I think chemistry is very close from cooking. So often we say that a good chemist is a good cooker. So I think we have a lot of good cooker tonight. So maybe we should have asked the Maison de la Chimie to maybe have access to the kitchen and to have some gathering. And for you, Mr. Xie, what brings you to policy? And can you explain us?
Thank you, Kemi. So, as some of you may know, I'm not the guest speaker that was meant to be in this chair, and I'm not a scientist, certainly by training. I work more in policy and more specifically in diplomacy. But it's interesting, my parents were both engineers, and I had no desire whatsoever really to become an engineer. And they eventually lived to understand that and to let me follow my own path. So I now work in the Australian Embassy here in Paris. Are there any Australians, by the way, in the audience? Yes, 1, 2, 3, yeah, okay, excellent. Even though wherever you are in the world, you can always be sure there'll be at least 1 or 2 Australians. It's impossible to get away from them. So I work in the embassy, and I cover a range of issues, but science and technology as part of them. Essentially, I did a bit of science in high school, including chemistry, but didn't pursue it. I then pursued law and French, and then did my master's in international relations. And so it's kind of a slightly different pathway, if you like, towards where I am. But you know, I guess the two things that drove me to pursue the choices that I made, and you know, I don't want to say career, but just the jobs and the opportunities, was, I think, two things. One was having a sense of what made me, you know, what interested me, what gave me pleasure, what gave me a sense of purpose, and also you can do this in many different ways. There's by no means a single way, but something where I felt I could make the world a better place in one way or another. And certainly, and we can come to this later, I'm sure, there's many ways in which you can do that through chemistry and through science, as well as through, government or diplomacy.
It's a nice way to ask you the next question, which is the main question for why we did this event today. What place do you think scientists or chemists actually have in policy with respect to the society, the current society, and what we can do? What you think we can do for the new challenge we have, such as the climate, the energy transition, and etc. What do you think?
That's a very big question. I'm very interested as well to hear Professor Bao's perspective on this. I've been fortunate that my sort of specialization in my studies in the international relations world was actually on environment and climate change, and so the first 6 or 7 years I worked on international issues that was focused on climate change, and I've got to say, I met through the course of that many great scientists who and read a lot of their work. Many of you would be familiar with the IPCC, and the science is really the basis that provides the basis for everything that we do in terms of policy advice, policy decisions, and so at a very fundamental level, if you don't have the knowledge, if you don't have the facts, then if you don't understand the problem, then there's no, it's very difficult to actually then look at how you might go about addressing it. So, I think the first thing I would say is if climate change is something that interests you, or another, if you like, another policy issue. Just another example, there's, I also cover in my role at the embassy questions around disarmament and non-proliferation. And there's a global norm not to use chemical weapons. They were a massive issue, particularly in the First World War, when you had chlorine, you had sulfur used in very horrific ways. And so I think it's since the 70s, there's been a global convention against the use of chemical weapons. And again, that is something that is underpinned by chemistry, by science, and when we still, from time to time, see the use of chemical weapons, notably in Syria in recent years, but also in the UK, you have scientists working, day and night to identify the substances, to track them, to be able to work out, how do you produce X or Y substance, and then how do you go about eventually holding those people to account. So, there are many different ways, I guess, in which science and chemistry can relate to policy. And I would say start with something that really interests you, and then see where that leads you in terms of how that can then build that interaction with policy.
Thank you. And you, Professor Bao, at some point in your career, were you interested to go in policy, or it's something that you have maybe in mind?
Well, not yet. current stage, I'm still focusing on the research aspect, but certainly I think at different stage of scientific career, initially when I was student and then started independent research, at the time the focus probably was mostly trying to get a project, get an idea to work and publish some papers. But then as one does more and more research and as I get exposed more to different areas, I start to realize that it's not enough just kind of mining your own research. It's really all the work we do is connected. The whole world is connected. And if we only kind of confine ourselves as scientists, we have that tendency to be just like to be in our own world, in our lab, and work on your own thing. But then I realized that to make an impact, one has to be able to first communicate to the general public the importance of the work, and not just the general public, but also to the politician, to the funding agencies. A certain direction is important. And furthermore, the policy side, because scientists do have responsibility the helping to shape the directions, future directions, solving big problems that mankind is facing, ranging from climate change to energy to health. All of the issues require a lot of strategic thinking, and what we choose to do right now and the direction we choose to do is going to impact 50 years down the road and 100 years down the road. So when start thinking about that, then I think as someone who has been in science for a long time, and then I start to feel the responsibility and also the importance to really talk to the government, talk to the policymaker to make sure that investment are putting into the proper direction. And especially right now with the current administration, it's even becoming more and more important how much scientists need to really voice the importance of future directions.
Do you think that young chemists, for example, in this room, they should maybe wait, maybe to launch their career, to be more involved in policy if they find some way, something interesting they want to be actor in? They should maybe wait a bit to go into it, or they can. That to be young will not be a limitation, you know.
Well, I always encourage my students and postdocs and young people to just follow their passion. And if it's something that they're passionate about, then they can start at any time, either young or old. And it could be policy, it could be business, entrepreneurship. If it's something they're passionate about, then they're going to make it happen. So I encourage people just follow their passion.
Right, it's nice to realize that. So just maybe one short, let's say, personal question before I will leave the mic. What is your boss biggest success and biggest failure? Hard question, I know.
Maybe just before I come to this, there's just one thing I'd like to add. Just on the previous question, I think I think there's different ways of approaching it. Certainly, you know, if we come back to climate change again, for example, you know, there are certainly scientists who have spoken out, and very highly esteemed scientists. I'm thinking in particular of James Hansen from NASA, who some of you may know, and people who've spent their careers working on a particular issue, and they have the expertise, they have that kind of authority, if you like, which helps to really raise the profile and have that kind of impact that you want. But equally, before I joined the Australian government to work on climate change, I was out there in NGOs, waving placards and being an activist, doing what young people do is going in the streets and making their voice heard. And I think they're both valid things to do. If you have if you're working in solar PV and you have a great technology that you've developed, then go and build a business out of it, and that will also help to make a contribution. So there's no kind of single path or single way of doing things. On my greatest success, I cannot claim for myself by any means, but I was very fortunate to have been part of the success of COP21 in Paris in 2015. So I was part of the Australian delegation, part of the negotiating team. That I had my particular issue and my particular area of the negotiations, but as a team, and indeed with all of the countries around the world, and it should be said, all of the civil society as well, that was looking at us, going, "Are you going to do this or not?" We made it happen, and that was an extraordinary moment. And the challenge now, obviously, is for us to be able to deliver on all of those commitments. I hesitate to nominate things in terms of failures, not because I haven't failed at things, and not because I think there's anything wrong with failing at things. And in fact, I think the more that you fail is also the more that you try to achieve things. And if you don't try, then you never know if you are going to succeed or fail. But I like to think of it as there are choices that you make, and I chose not to pursue chemistry or mathematics, which I was also doing at the time. I chose to pursue law and French and so on. And I look back and I think, did I make the right decision, or what would have happened if I had done things differently? And I think ultimately you never know. And I think instead of looking at it in terms of success or failure or right or wrong, it's really just about you make the decisions that you make at the time, and you see what happens. And as long as you're kind of always looking forward to what's next, then there's that's the best you can do.
Well, for me, it's a little bit difficult to name one big success, or because I see the success is building on a lot of lessons that we learned, and over time we learn more and more, and kind of the knowledge builds up. I guess the most the moments that I being most proud of, there have been several. One is being able to build world's first printed organic circuits, and then later first flexible electronic paper, and then more recently first artificial mechanoreceptors and electronic skin. So these are all the moments I'm proud of, and of course I view as an educator myself, my biggest success are really my students. students. My students and postdocs, they are my most important products. When they land great jobs and great places and become successful themselves, I feel that that's the most proud moment that I have. For example, one recent student who graduated in, I think, 2009, he started a company. Within 4 years, his company now value $3 billion, and they roll out the first foldable smartphone that you can order actually on the market. So those are really, I think I feel my most proud moments of really seeing the success of my former students. In terms of failure, I have very similar view as what Ken just mentioned. Frequently, I tell my students, don't think about failed experiment or successful experiments. Experiments are used to test hypothesis. It's meant to tell us something, and from doing those experiments. So if the experiments do not fit the hypothesis, that means our hypothesis, maybe certain assumptions are incorrect. As long as the procedures are carried out in a proper way and the controls are being designed in proper way, then there's no failed experiments. Failed experiments only when there's no proper control. So I think it's really knowledge we learned through various different experiments, whether experiments in science or experiments in life. We always learn something when things do not turn out as expected.
Thank you very much. So maybe we go to next question.
Okay,
Victor?
I will start. Thanks a lot first expressing us your views on failure as well. That shows us that even the greatest are still human, so it's quite important and inspiring, I believe, to see that it's not easy for anyone, but you have to learn from the mistakes, so thanks for that. So I had a question, just coming back on what you just discussed on climate change. These days, the voice of the youth is quite strong, I feel, about climate change, and we can see, for example, Greta Thunberg and many Youth for Climate, etc., that are demonstrating their concerns about it. But I have a feeling that it does not really result into concrete measures. Would you have any suggestions to the youth scientists that are in front of you on what they could do to actually change the things more than discussing the issue, but going towards solution?
Which one wants to start?
I can start. I think, of course, there is the part of changing the policy and changing how the government will invest in new technologies. As scientists, certainly we can help to advocate about the facts. And on the other hand, also our research directions could be chosen to be developing alternative energy and could be developing more, especially as chemists, more sustainable sources for making new materials or for pharmaceuticals and green chemistry and all the work we're doing as chemists. We could take a view of thinking about how our work might impact climate change, and then from our own work start to make changes, maybe small changes, but if as a community we all think in that way, in that direction, then it can accumulate together and make a big impact.
Yeah. So I think the starting point is to say, look, if climate change is obviously, a very big, if not the biggest global long-term challenge that we face, and I guess arguably short-term as well as long-term. And it's obvious that if it was easy, then we would have done it by now. And so there are, it's a very complex issue, not just in terms of, the international aspect of it, or the technology aspect of it, or you could say the political, the economic side. It's not something that is going to be easy to address, and I think so. The answer is really we need all the levers. You need people who are going to develop and deploy the technologies, solutions. You need people who are going to be able to change the financial and economic calculations that make certain investments less attractive and others more attractive. And you need the politics to change from where it is now. And that's not a comment on any particular country or any particular government. It's just a reflection that, the global ambition as it stands now is not up to where we need it to be to reach, at most 2 degrees, if not 1.5 or somewhere in between. In terms of, and just on that front, then, the politics is a reflection of many things. It's a reflection of the interests that are at play in society, but it's also a reflection of what the public wants and needs. And so, like I said before, I'm working in government. I have worked in government on this issue before. I've also dealt with this or engaged with this from an NGO perspective, and I've met many people who work in renewable energy, in carbon markets, in sort of more, I guess, agricultural or forestry, or sort of more in those sectors. And I think it comes back to what kind of difference and what kind of impact do we individually and collectively think we can make the biggest impact on. I think in many ways that's a very personal reflection. That's a very personal decision. The more, all can I say is, the more of us that are working on it, the better.
Thanks.
Okay, so to keep going in that direction, actually, thank you for mentioning the notion of the more of us, the better, because what we hear a lot in the news is sometimes politicians or people in the industry saying that we need to achieve great goals by 2030. Typically the Sustainable Development Goals of UN, that is probably in a lot of people's minds these days. So, some people as scientists have a fear that these goals are really difficult to achieve, maybe even over-ambitious. So this possibly raises the question of what are the means. And we like to ask you, from the side of politics, what is your vision of this, how to improve the means, such as we are enough people to work on these questions and we might achieve some of these goals by 2030.
Start us off. So the Sustainable Development Goals are interesting because they are really the first attempt that we've made to set effectively a universal framework for all countries. So it's something that applies, here in France or in Australia or in the US, but also to countries like China or Togo or Colombia, and I totally just picked them randomly. So in a way, what is great now is that we have something that everyone in the world has signed up to, that every country in the world, almost every country, has signed up to, and that we have a sort of a shared vision and a shared goal or goals that we want to achieve. What's equally clear is that every country is coming at it from a different starting point. And it's as much about what, it's as much about a domestic issue as it is something that we can all work together on, and certainly that's part of it. I think as with all of these things, there are things, there are aspects that are negotiated. The reason we have 17 and not like a neat number like 10 or 20 or 15 or 12 is because we had to find a way that included what all the countries wanted to see reflected and all of their different priorities. But equally, the real, I think, challenge will be, as you were saying, how do we put that into practice? Now that we've set these ambitious goals, how do we get everyone at the international level, but also within each of our societies, no matter what you're doing, to see the way that what your work, that your life can relate to those goals. And it comes back to what we were saying before about communication, making something like that understandable and relatable to the everyday person when they have, children to feed, or they have, their own projects and their own things to worry about, is not an easy thing to do, but it's something that in different ways we need to keep doing.
Professor Bao, maybe you want to?
Well, I think setting a aggressive goal will promote a different approach, because otherwise, and also at the same time gives the message that there is a strong urgency for this issue to be addressed. Depending on how we set the goal, then the approach can be completely different. So I'm very much someone who promotes aggressive goals, and then we try it, and then that will determine the approach and make people think out of the box. And then if we try our best, cannot do it, then we try our best. So that's always my view of approaching things.
Thank you.
Thanks. So, Professor Bao, I may have a question on a different topic, maybe to diversify a bit. You discussed of your biggest achievement in this stretchable electronics that you also presented this morning in this wonderful talk that will very likely result in a new age in medicine. And I was wondering, as citizens, we can always ask ourselves, how much is the risk of losing control of the data that is collecting through hacking or through commercial use or things like this? Did you reflect on these things? I'm sure you did, and what is your opinion on that use?
With wearable electronics and implantable electronics, there are a lot of concerns about who is going to own the data, who is going to see the data, and what are we going to do with the data. So that's certainly a very important question. That's also why when I started working more and more on this research from the technology side, I started to realize that for something to really be successful and be a technology that will eventually get adopted, then as scientists, I cannot just think about only the technology. I have to talk to people who are in the data security, who are experts, who understand what will it takes to get to the next level, and then really understand from that point of view what are the potential requirements on designing these devices devices and systems so that down the road, consumers and patients are actually going to be willing to use them. So this is still a learning process. We don't have a general solution, and also depends on what is the purpose of the wearable, what we are trying to measure. There are different implications. So looks like it has to be case by case to really design the appropriate appropriate privacy strategy for each application. But that's definitely something very important to consider for the technology.
So I guess if we go further down that line, that means that for any new technology, especially revolutionary one, there will be sometime a need for regulation that will appear down the way. And something we see around us as young chemists is that of course, politicians are from the whole society, so they don't necessarily have a scientific background, and they still make the laws. And so they rely most of the time on experts, right? And what we see often around is that most of these experts so far are people, let's say, reaching the end of their career, which is very interesting because they have a highly diversified scientific background, very large view, but we also feel sometimes that they might not have the most updated or accurate notions of some very particularly technical works that has just been done. So we are wondering if it would be meaningful, and we would really like your opinion on this, to have more younger scientists being interrogated as experts. And so we wonder also how to make the politicians engage better with young scientists, not just for outreach or popularization of science, but maybe also for expertise. Would you see an opportunity like this in the future?
In addition to engaging young scientists for outreach, and instead, I didn't get the last part.
Or like being experts, being interrogated when there is a new law to be made. Often you will interrogate experts of the fields to try to delineate the new law, and the question is how to make these experts be maybe more diverse in age, so you also reach the deeper knowledge in the very updated part of science that are moving very fast and not easy to reach for people with a very large view.
Can young chemists be experts near politicians to help to solve and to write or the law that are made actually? What do you think?
I'll start us off. I think they can, but I think the challenge is with policy. There are always, I guess, many competing views, and the view of a science or of scientific expertise is definitely necessary. The question is what is the best way of incorporating that, and that's where in climate change, for example, it's been very valuable to have the IPCC, because that can be established as the authoritative scientific view, and there can be, that's not to say that there can't be still some disagreements or, some areas of uncertainty, but that can be reflected in what is essentially a consensus view across that scientific community. I think that's, in a way, harder with some of the sort of emerging technologies around digital, because they're, and particularly sort of the ethical side, where you have, on the one hand, kind of more, the hard sciences, the mathematics, the physics, and so on, and all the computer sciences, and on the other side, the more sort of philosophical or sociological, and getting, I think there is, the best way, perhaps, is to have, as many of those views reflected as possible, because when you have issues like that affect society as a whole, you can't just think of it from one perspective only. You have to look at it across the different disciplines. And I think I guess my perspective would be look at what you can bring to that and what is the best way that you can bring your perspective. And in many instances that won't be you as an individual, but it may be you as part of a broader organization that inputs in different ways into the policy process.
Want to add something?
Well, certainly to bridge science and the policy require people who can talk both languages, and there are increasing opportunities for young people to say major in two kinds of degrees.
Do you think I have enough expertise, I have good enough standing amongst my community, I can make an effect outside my area of expertise?
Well, for me, I think it's a gradual learning process, and well, initially starting out with trying to make an impact within my own area because I understand it the best. And then slowly bridging to other interdisciplinary field and learning from others and better understand what are the problems and the issues. I think it's and in terms of really starting to see the potential possibility to make a difference in areas other than my scientific area is when I started to serve in committees. For example, in the United States, the National Academy of Science and the National Academy of Engineering has committees to, I served on the committee for chemical science, which look at issues of, for example, industrial safety, laboratory safety, to potentially reports on climate change and alternative energy. So when I started serving on those committees, probably about 10 years ago, I started to realize that that's how scientists can potentially make a difference with help of organization, and these with these committees, it was a lot of work. We interview people who are experts in certain topic, and then we try to understand the issues and then write reports, and the reports sometimes also involve additional workshops to have experts from different areas. And then in the final report there will be recommendations, but those are not recommendations made by individuals, but rather by a group of people. And then those reports are going to be given to policymakers and also used for publication to disseminate to the general public. And that's when I start to feel that, oh, these information that go into these kinds of organized committee reports may start to make an impact. It's hard to know. We never had a study on what is the outcome of these reports, unfortunately. But I feel that this is a kind of volunteer work, but I feel that it's a volunteer work that I think will make some impact. Yeah.
Do you think that maybe in our studies, even if we go for science, we may need some more courses around policy and how it works, and maybe to see and to catch how it works, and to see where, as a scientist, we can maybe have a place to be?
Well, I think it will certainly be helpful to know the basics, but also we all have limited time to take many courses. So from my experience in collaboration and working on interdisciplinary work, I find it's always very fruitful to have experts who are on the other side. For example, in this case, it could be working with people who knows how policies are made and how policies work, and could be politician who is passionate about climate change issue, and then they can be the people who work together with scientists to make a difference. And in that case, then we do what we're best, and then learn the language from the other experts, and then eventually maybe we will learn also to talk both languages. So.
You want to add something, maybe?
I think to come back to the point, whether it's in diplomacy or in science or any field, things are only achieved when you work with other people, when you work together in teams. There's a saying, sort of an African saying that Al Gore likes to quote, which is, if you want to go fast, go alone, but if you want to go far, go together. And if you want to have real impact, then you need to work with others, and you need to be able to influence and communicate. And to be able to do that, you need to be able to see things from their perspective and see what motivates them, see what the bigger picture is. And that's where I think the value in many different ways of getting to know different perspectives, of exchanging with people who aren't chemists as well, or aren't scientists, will enrich you not just in a professional sense, but also in a personal sense, because that's how you build those relationships. That's how you can go far together.
Yeah, I completely agree with this. Yeah, it's the reason why we created all these networks that were presented today. So, is there any question? Yeah, Alice after. Sorry.
Thank you so much. So I have two questions, one both related to communication on the practical side. So one for related to science communication, if you have some practical tricks or like tips to give us in order to go out of this room and say, okay, let's spread the voice of science outside to a general public. And one in the other side, more related to communication among the countries, because I'm, as a YCN, I face sometimes problems of communication between the countries. Because if you think about several countries, different mentalities and so on, so you have to approach in a different way every time. So I think that as ambassador, maybe you can give some practical tips to us about this. Thank you very much.
Okay, in terms of communication, I feel it's usually most effective if we have a clear message in mind. Then with the clear message, then as scientists, our challenge is always how do we make our message easy to understand for non-scientists, and how do we not trying to give too much information. That's also the other tendency we like to have. But as long as we have clear message and general language that people can easily relate to or understand, then maybe on top of that, practicing practicing a lot with different audience to see which method or which way of communication can get the message across, and then try different ways.
So I agree with everything that Professor Bao just said. I think the value of being clear in what you're saying can't be underestimated. And also, I guess perhaps less in an international sense, but just in a general professional sense, I always ask myself the question: so what? I can say lots of words, and they can kind of mean something. Hopefully, they do. But what do I actually want the other person to get out of it? What do I want them to think or to understand from what I am saying? There's a message, and there's I guess what do you intend for them to do with that information that you're giving them? And so when you have this problem of having then different cultures and different ways of communicating and understanding issues and approaching issues, I think it's some combination of doing what feels natural and comfortable for you, but also trying to think about, are they really understanding what you want them to understand? And that's why often, sort of checking with them before you finish the conversation, are we on the same page? Have I said A and you've heard B, even though I thought you've heard A, can be a useful trick.
So I've seen a question on the back. Yeah, Maximilian, please.
Hello, thank you all for this wonderful talk. It's been very informative. My name is Lori Brown. I work for the ACS, actually, in our External Affairs and Communications office. And I just wanted to plug a little program that we've got that might be useful. We've talked a lot about, if you've got a background in science, how do you get involved in politics and policy making? There are opportunities out there to do internships within legislative bodies, within governmental organizations that can really be enlightening and useful to get sort of on-the-ground experience. So ACS has a public policy fellowship that you don't have to be a U.S. citizen to apply for. So I'd encourage you to look not only into what we do, but what some of the other sister societies do as well in this area, because there might be opportunities out there for you.
Yeah, thank you. Very nice to hear that. It brings me to a question, because I've seen that we had a lot of questions in the audience asked by women, so it's very nice to see this. One question we had, actually, is that often when you're a woman, young as we can be here in the room, at some point, so you want to have a family, and when you got pregnant, there are times that you cannot go back into the lab to perform your own experiments for safety reasons. And it's often in the just right time in your career that it's going to be launched, I wish I should say. So what do you think that our institutions can do to help women not to have this kind of hole in their career?
Well, certainly the institution could think about planning or help the person to develop a plan so that during that period of time, the person can still be productive. For example, some of my graduate students, even though we don't have a policy in place saying that the pregnant student or postdoc is forbidden to go into the lab, but certainly, and we make it to be the personal choice of what they feel more comfortable in planning that special time of their life. But there could be things that, as advisor or the supervisor in a certain institution, can work together with the person to develop a plan. For example, in my case, my student, especially when they get to later stage of their pregnancy, we may come up with a review article that the person can write and do some literature search and do some writing, or they plan their experiments so that they have most of the experiments already finished, and then during the later stage, then they mainly do data analysis and writing, or work with others to have more discussions instead of actually working in the lab. So I think these are all things can be planned so that the person can remain productive and still also be able to enjoy that special time of their life.
There is something here in France we are pretty proud of. This is done by the Fondation of Maison de la Chimie here. They propose that the woman who got pregnant to get a fellowship, to have a postdoctorate after they come back to the lab. So maybe it's something that, I don't know if it have been done in other countries, but it's something that the institution may maybe propose more often to us, I should say. So I think we are quite to the end of this event. So before finishing, first I would like to thank our speakers. So I think we have something for you. I cannot do both, guys. So really, thank you very much for being here with us tonight, by accepting our invitation.